All right. Hi, everyone. So my name is Jennifer Mascia, and I'm a senior news writer and a founding staffer at The Trace. We are the country's only news outlet covering gun violence exclusively. We launched 10 years ago, and we are a nonprofit. And when we launched, it was in the middle of a really volatile time. We had one back-to-back mass casualty event after another. It was baptism by fire. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. And I'm going to say something that's a little strange, but I kind of wish we had no reason to exist because after 10 years, we could have three times the staff and still not be able to cover every angle of this topic because the topic of gun violence has roots in every other topic um, of every beat: public health, crime and justice, mass incarceration, public safety, even culture and entertainment. So when I originally was asked to give this talk, it was at the SPJ conference in May. And to be honest, I wasn't really sure what to talk about. After the presidential election, I was confused. I think some of us were thrown for a loop because, you know, those of us who had dedicated our journalism to public service and myth busting and fact checking, it seemed like that didn't really seem to sway voters. And uh, especially in the nonprofit news world, we look at impact. How is what we're reporting impacting others? Is our reporting cited in studies by lawmakers? Do policies come from it? It's not page views and clicks for us. And so it seemed to me, are we really having an impact if voters are voting with half the facts or looking at facts and saying that they don't matter? It's kind of like, as journalists, what have we been doing, all these years? What have I been doing for 20 years in this career? So um, that kind of got me thinking, what should I be doing? There's a shock and hour in this news cycle. What stories will even break through? Where can I be most useful? Right now, thankfully, there aren't a lot of mass casualty events happening in this country. And that's usually how people become aware of gun violence, even though most gun violence are not mass shootings. But, um, you know, in those in between times, where can I have an effect? Um, whose stories should we be telling in this time of upheaval? When this is all over, what should I be able to say that I did, to help bolster democracy, to get the truth out there? So I decided to go back to the basics, not just for this talk, but for my career. It was a point of reflection. And so we have a question and answer. This is the Trace's homepage. This is just a little example of the reporting that we do. But we have this question and answer series called Ask the Trace, which are basically explainers. We launched it in 2018, but it had been dormant for about a year. And I figured maybe now is the time to use this as a vehicle to dispel myths whenever we can. And we can use data to do it. It's really hard to argue with data. Data is not emotional. This topic, this debate are very emotional. And data can kind of cut through all of that noise. Even though we're having a problem with people coalescing around different facts and seeing data in different lights, all we can do is put it out there. So the gun debate is interesting because there's so many misconceptions about it, right? People think that our gun laws are a lot stronger than they are. We have background checks that capture nothing but criminal history, very little, mental health history, unless you've been involuntarily committed. It doesn't cover social media activity, extremism, or arrests that don't result in convictions. So there are a lot of people who have contact with the criminal justice system who are still allowed to own guns. I think a lot of Americans might be surprised by that. Uh, you know, Federal law prohibits handgun sales to people under 21 who are adults, so 18 to 20-year-olds, but only through federally licensed dealers. Private sales, are allowed. Digital gun tracing is very limited because of a push by the gun industry to limit the data that's made public about guns. I think the perception is that if that data was public, the conclusions would be used to bolster gun control, and we can't have that. Only a few states have assault weapon bans. I think that Americans might be surprised by that. There are a lot of data gaps. We don't have sales figures for gun sales. We have proxies and estimates, but we don't have actual sales figures. We don't know how many guns are out there. In a country like Canada or any countries in Europe, they are able to have a gun census because they have records and registration. We don't have that here. We don't know how many people are wounded each year by guns. There's a lot of public health data that has gaps. We don't know all of the gun's previous owners because of the fact that we allow private sales. There's a lot of barriers to public understanding, and a lot of misinformation. Nearly a quarter of guns are legally sold without a background check in this country. Only 3 states have handgun registration. You don't have to prove in most states that you know how to shoot a gun in order to carry it in public. Some felons can still have guns. It just depends on what kind of crime you committed and how long you spent in prison. So you have to wade through all of that, really, to reach the public. And so, and this data is all data that, the gun industry, as I said before, tries to obscure. So explainers are a good way of laying a foundation for the entire beat. So as the Trace started in 2018, our engagement editor entered into a collaboration with Harkin, which is an audience engagement consultancy, to help us develop a reader-driven feature that could expand our impact. We wanted to cover topics that people wanted to know about and even involve the audience in story selection. So we were one of 34 newsrooms to receive a grant from the Community Listening and Engagement Fund. And we used that grant to start Ask the Trace. And we solicited questions from the public. We used our newsletter and our website to do that. And we had readers vote for their favorite. So we whittled down what people wanted to know about. And this was really useful information because, starting out a beat, we were still new. It helped us as reporters learn about what people wanted to know about. And, we have probably gotten 1,000 questions in the last 7 years, and people write to us about everything. Here's a list of when the questions come in, they all come into this one spreadsheet, and people sound off. We get trolls. People accuse us of being anti-gun, which we're not. Some of our staffers are gun owners themselves. Gun control advocates are pushing for certain policies. And we also have devoted readers who keep us on our toes and write us over and over, and some of them have really good ideas. We get asked questions, and this is an example of one reader who's asked us like 25 questions at least. And we get asked about things that seem like they're simple, but they're not. Sometimes the answer is not one that can be found. Sometimes it's show your work and show why an answer can't be found. So that's really useful as a reporter. I'm always learning something new by answering questions readers want to know about. And we addressed all of it. We started by answering the critics. They would submit rhetorical questions, more like rants, and we took them on. A lot of times the trolls keep you on your toes. We rooted our answers in data wherever possible. And for this one, should suicides be considered gun violence? It might seem like a no-brainer to some people, but there's a talking point in the gun rights world that suicide shouldn't be included in the annual gun death toll because they're not the result of interpersonal violence. And so they're not really a threat to society. Of course, suicides include murder-suicides. And there are hundreds of those a year. So we looked at what other countries do and found out that they don't really differentiate between types of gun violence. Homicide and suicide, it's all death. Of course, if you leave out suicides, that subtracts 58% of the gun death toll, according to CDC data. So a gun rights advocate, of course, would want to argue for the lower number because it makes it seem like we don't have as big a gun violence problem as we do. The next one, how often are guns used for self-defense? This is a very hot topic in the gun debate. And here we found out that guns are used for self-defense a lot less than they're used in crime. So we got our data from the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is a twice yearly poll of crime victims conducted by the federal government. So you don't even have to make an ideological argument with this one. This one was, show the data and let the reader come to their own conclusions. And of course, critics can say, well, your data isn't accurate, or, your data isn't, our data. Your data isn't our poll of gun owners. And with this topic, you have to learn to be satisfied with however close you can get, because it's never going to be perfect data. So the next one was how often are AR-style rifles used for self-defense? Gun rights supporters, especially in court cases, argue that semi-automatic rifles are in common use. And that phrase is a legal one. If they can convince the courts that these are guns or something that millions of people own and rely on, then state bans are a lot less likely to stand. So we look to see just how common it is that people actually use these guns for self-defense. And what we found is that, well, first we analyzed data from the Gun Violence Archive. They're a nonprofit that's been compiling shooting data through news and police reports since 2013. So we grabbed every incident tagged AR-15, and we whittled down what were legal uses of that gun and took out the illegal uses of that gun. And what we did was we showed our work, because I immediately anticipated that the trolls would be on us and they'd want to know how we got this number. And so we said, well, we found a number of instances that said we have to take these out because they're not legal uses. They are, used. The gun was used by a felon. It was illegal used. And we found 51 incidents. Whoops. I went forward a little bit. We found 51 incidents in 10 years. So basically 5 times a year, somebody is using an AR-15 in self-defense. That doesn't seem like a lot, and it doesn't seem like enough to justify not regulating them. Because remember, self-defense is the linchpin for all of the arguments to have guns. We need to be able to have a chance against somebody who's going to attack us. And what we found was that, this is not a gun that people automatically grab. In self-defense, it's unwieldy. People really do prefer concealed handguns. So that argument kind of falls flat. And we didn't even make that conclusion. We just put the data out there. And that's all we can do. For the next one, and this is one I'm most proud of, how many guns are circulating in the US? So it has been said for years that it's impossible to know how many guns are in civilian hands in America because the market is so unregulated and we don't have registration. We don't require background checks on private sales. But I had seen ATF production figures. All the manufacturers, anyone who makes guns and gun parts in this country, have to report their output to the ATF every year. So I went back as far as I could go with ATF production reports, and I went back to 1899. It took a lot of digging. And we found that all the numbers in those production reports added up to 512 million guns produced for the US market from 1899 to the present. So basically, in the 20th and 21st centuries, 500 million guns have been produced. Now, we assume that a certain percentage of guns fell out of circulation. Not many people are still carrying pistols from 1930. But when we took away a certain percentage, we estimated that we could have as many as 392 million guns in civilian hands. This is the first time this number had been reported. that wasn't estimates, that we actually added up the numbers. The ATF didn't add up the numbers. That's what first made me want to add up the numbers. The fact that we didn't have the data, the fact that they were keeping it from us. These production reports had columns that didn't have totals at the bottom. And I said, that is so strange. We're just going to go ahead and do that. So we have a massive spreadsheet that we're always updating. But I wanted to know what effect all of these guns were having on gun deaths. Because what you're doing is you're flooding the market with guns. Well, does gun violence go up when production goes up? So I looked at gun deaths and I looked at production and I put them side by side, basically, or, one on top of the other. And as you can see, the peaks and valleys are almost mirror images. And, that suggests some kind of correlation between gun violence and gun deaths, not causation, because we can't prove causation, but we can point to a connection, a possible association, and let researchers do the rest and figure out, the whys and the what's causing it. But here we have this sort of blockbuster finding that no one had ever really looked at before. And it had legs, because one of the proudest accomplishments of my career is that you can search how many guns in an incognito Google window. And this story is the first result. This is a data point that everyone said was unknowable, but people want to know about it because they keep searching for it. But I just knew it wasn't, and I wasn't satisfied with that answer. So we just kept digging, and Ask the Trace was the perfect vehicle for us to do that. A recent story we did that was really successful was what generation is most affected by gun violence. This is kind of a surprising data point that no one else had reported. So we used CDC gun death data, and we found that guns are the leading cause of death for Gen Z. This actually came from a question that one of the people who wrote us over and over again, one of our super fans, asked us. And, never completely ignore your super fans or your trolls, because they can give you really good ideas. This is the first time this has happened, that guns are the leading cause of death for a generation, because the same age group 20 years ago, it was car crashes. Guns have also been the leading cause of death for Gen Z since 2017. So when the youngest Zoomers were kindergarten age and the oldest ones couldn't even legally drink, guns were the number one cause of death for that cohort. That's just astonishing to me. And that also makes me question what's going to happen with Gen Alpha. Is it going to be the same story, that every young generation now, guns are going to be their biggest problem before diseases take hold? So millennials are the largest living generation. They have the most gun deaths, but in terms of raw numbers, that's the case. But Gen Z is the third largest generation, and they're punching above their weight with the second largest number of gun deaths out of all the generations. So we always have these generation wars, Gen X versus millennials versus, well, this is a really tragic version of that. And it really does make me worry about the future. And again, no one had broken this down along generational lines before. So now this resulted in a really successful panel where we spoke to some of those Gen Z leaders and thought leaders on this. And talk to them about the burden that they're going to have to face, because guns are the number one cause of death for them. Another one we did was how often are guns involved in accidental deaths? This is something that a lot of people buy guns for self-defense and find that a gun is used instead more often in an accidental shooting, or even more tragically, a suicide. But for this one, we looked at CDC data and we found that accidental shooting deaths were actually going down except for one demographic, and that was kids under 5. And that was a really, really chilling discovery. And experts told us that because of this focus on armed self-defense, it's really influenced the way guns are designed, making them easier to shoot and use, and also more attractive to kids. So in the rush to have a tool of self-defense at the ready that you can use to save your own life, kids are finding these guns instead. And that's definitely not what any of us intended. So that was a really chilling finding. Um, and then another one is are handguns or rifles used more often in mass shootings? Uh, sometimes we present data that doesn't toe the gun control line, even though that we are accused of being gun control advocates. Our early funding and some of our funding still comes from a gun control group, but we're completely independent. We're all journalists. A lot of us went to Columbia J School. We're not advocates. We're a separate nonprofit entity. So, it's understandable that skepticism, but we definitely don't consult with the gun control movement at all. And this was one of those times where we will present no matter what findings. And whenever there's a mass shooting, people want to know, is it because of an assault rifle? And, then gun control groups call for a ban on them. And in fact, handguns are responsible for the majority of mass shootings. Assault weapons are involved in more mass shootings in decades past, and they take a larger number of casualties than handguns tend to in each shooting. But handguns are still used in more mass shootings. And so, that was an important finding and something that probably should be updated, because I have a feeling that might change. But yeah, and then we also used Ask the Trace to run down essential, like foundational data points of this beat, which states have universal background checks. Easy peasy. Most Americans think we have background checks on every gun sale, but in 30 states, you can buy a gun at a yard sale and no one's the wiser. I think if people understood how weak our gun laws really were, maybe they'd make different choices or have different opinions about it in the voting booth and in life. A lot of this is going to be, a lot of this safety issue is going to be solved, in the cultural realm. What if we are a culture of gun safety? Then we wouldn't need laws to compel us, and I guess the hope is, in the absence of those laws like Europe has or Canada, that maybe a culture of gun safety can take over and be the prevailing culture. So it's not always about influencing laws and lawmakers, because on some level that's dead on the federal level, really. It's about influencing the culture. And maybe it will be taboo to leave a gun around. And maybe we'll have a little part of, maybe we'll have contributed to that school of thought. Permitless carry is another one. 29 states don't require a permit or training to carry a concealed gun. That's something that might surprise people. And in the states where you don't need a background check for a private sale, you can carry a gun and basically buy a gun with no one the wiser, and then carry it in your purse, and you're untrained. You don't need training. So this is a public safety concern. And then red flag laws, which states have gun violence restraining orders. So after the Parkland shooting in 2018, when Florida passed a red flag law, we used Ask the Trace to examine which other states had red flag laws. And, we keep a running tracker, and every time another state passes one, we update it, and it's up to 21 states. We're not saying these laws are a panacea, a panacea. We're just saying, this is a policy that people were moved to after a public safety failure, and we're just kind of tracking the progress. And of course, different states have different red flag laws. In some states, only a police officer can take a gun from someone who's potentially a risk, and it's a civil procedure. It is not a criminal procedure. So it's quite different from the way guns are taken in other scenarios like domestic violence. And then recently we did the gun industry makes billions, but how many exactly? Another difficult fact, data point to dig up. It's very hard because most gun companies are privately held and don't need to report their earnings. So the answer we arrived at is really full of gaps and caveats, but sometimes that's the point. You show the reader how far you went down the rabbit hole, and it kind of begs the question, why is there a rabbit hole in the first place? Maybe the rabbit hole is the problem. So coming up empty data wise is not the end for this, which is so great about Ask the Trace. It's kind of the beginning of a longer story, which is why don't we know more? And some of our most read Ask the Traces are stories I've gone over here today. As you can see, most of our traffic comes from Google searches, and that tells us that the public is asking these questions. And as long as that need exists, as long as people are looking for this information, something like Ask the Trace is necessary. So even if we can't force people to believe facts, at least we'll be here for the people who seek them out. And there's also, I also really quickly wanted to point out a project that we've undertaken, which is sort of, it's different than Ask the Trace, but it's our data hub. And this is a few years ago, we drew up plans for a repository for all these stats and public records we come across on our beat. Because there is so much data missing, when we find data, it's like a big deal. And we realized that we wanted to make that data available to other reporters. So we have a team that's fielding data requests from journalists. So please be in touch. I'll have my email address at the end. When we launched last fall, we didn't expect data preservation to be a part of this, but we don't know what could be wiped by the federal government. So we are also downloading and scraping data. So far, CDC figures are, like for gun deaths, are still being updated. We haven't run up against any big roadblocks. So that's encouraging. But definitely check it out and explore our data sets, which we are updating all the time. And two of the resources that we really rely upon for Ask the Trace, I just wanted to kind of point to today. One of them is, as I said before, Gun Violence Archive. They're a nonprofit that has a staff of about 24 people tracking shootings in the news and police reports. It's really the best resource we have for gun injuries because it has case details. The CDC for injuries takes estimates from hospitals. They are not exact figures and they do not have details. So this is a really good resource for gun injuries, and it's free. The next one is CDC Wonder, which is really good for gun deaths. They compile the cause of death from death certificates submitted by states. They don't have case details, but you can break down gun deaths by gender, location, race, time, period. So CDC Wonder is something I rely on constantly for Ask the Trace. And there is my email. Feel free to reach out. And that's it. Happy to take questions from whoever's still there. Or not. Adam, want to have